There's a particular kind of quiet that settles into a pawn shop after the gate comes down, different from any other quiet I've known. The display cases keep humming under their little fluorescent lights, glass catching the glow off old guitars and gold chains and pistols nobody's come back for. And somewhere in that hum there's a stillness that feels less like absence of sound and more like something standing just outside it, waiting for the right moment to step through. I noticed it most on my third night, around 2 in the morning, when the ceiling fan in the back room started ticking in a rhythm that didn't match its blades. 4 ticks for every 3 rotations, steady as a clock that's been wound by somebody who doesn't quite understand how clocks are supposed to work. I climbed up to check the motor housing myself, certain I'd find a loose screw or a bent fan blade clipping the housing on every 4th pass. There was nothing wrong with it. The fan turned clean and even, no clipping, no obstruction, and yet that 4th tick kept landing right on schedule every time, like the room itself was keeping a separate count from the one the fan was actually making. My name's Marcus Hale, and 4 months ago I was working the parts counter at a transmission shop on the east side of Tulsa. Decent enough work, steady enough hours, until the owner sold out to a regional chain that brought in their own people and let half the old staff go inside of a week. I'd just turned 31. I had a kid on the way with my girlfriend Dana, a lease that wasn't going to wait for me to find something new, and about 6 weeks of savings that wasn't going to stretch much further than that. I took every interview I could get, mostly daytime retail jobs that paid too little to matter, until I saw a listing for an overnight clerk at a pawn shop off Admiral Boulevard that paid almost twice what anywhere else was offering for the same kind of work. I'd driven past Tulsa Trade and Loan 100 times without ever really looking at it. The kind of building that blends into a strip of similar storefronts, bars on the windows, a faded sign with a pawnbroker's 3 gold balls hanging slightly crooked from its bracket. The owner, a heavyset man named Glenn Drummond who'd run the place for going on 30 years, interviewed me himself in a back office crowded with unclaimed merchandise stacked floor to ceiling. He asked about my experience handling cash, asked if I had a problem working alone through the night, asked if I'd ever fired a gun, which struck me as an odd question until he mentioned there'd be a pistol kept under the counter for emergencies. I told him I had some experience hunting growing up outside Sepulpa, and that seemed to satisfy him well enough. He hired me on the spot, told me to start the following Monday, and said somebody would be in to train me on the overnight procedures before my first solo shift. I left that office feeling lighter than I had in weeks, already running numbers in my head about what the pay would mean for the baby coming, for the lease, for all of it. The man who trained me introduced himself as Otis. Older fellow, maybe pushing 70, with hands that shook just slightly when he wasn't actively using them. The kind of tremor that comes from age or nerves or both at once. He'd worked the overnight shift at that pawn shop for longer than Glenn had even owned it, going back to whoever ran the place before him, though he never said exactly how many years that added up to. He walked me through the register, the layaway system, the security cameras that covered every angle of the floor except for one blind spot behind the gun case that he pointed out almost reluctantly, like he wished he didn't have to mention it at all. Then he set down a worn spiral notebook on the counter between us, pages soft and curling at the edges from handling, and the air in that shop seemed to thicken the moment his hand came off the cover. "There's rules for working this shift," he said. 8 of them. I know that sounds like a lot for a pawn shop job, but you follow every one of them exact, every single night, and you won't have any trouble. Skip even one, even just the one time, and I can't promise you what happens next. He opened the notebook to the first page, though he barely needed to look at it. The words came out of him steady and practiced, worn smooth from however many times he'd said them to however many men who'd stood where I was standing. Rule 1. Anything brought in after midnight that you don't recognize, any item that doesn't look like it belongs to this century, you appraise it fast and you don't ask the seller where it came from. You give them whatever the scanner says it's worth, and you get it into the case as quick as you can. Rule 2. Never count the register out loud. Count it in your head, write the total down, but don't say the numbers out loud, not even under your breath. I don't know why that matters. I only know it does. Rule 3. If the pawn ticket printer jams and prints a name you don't recognize instead of the customer standing in front of you, you void that ticket immediately and you print a fresh one. Don't show the customer the misprint. Don't read it out loud either. Rule 4. There's a blind spot behind the gun case the cameras don't cover. If you ever catch movement back there out of the corner of your eye while you're working the front counter, you do not walk over to check it. You finish whatever you're doing at the counter first, slow and steady, and only then do you look. Rule 5. The shop closes the security gate at 11 sharp, no matter who's still inside browsing, no matter how close they are to making a purchase. You tell them politely the shop's closing and you get that gate down before midnight, every single night, without exception. Rule 6. If a customer offers to sell you a wedding ring still warm to the touch, you decline the sale. Doesn't matter what condition it's in, doesn't matter what they're asking for it. You tell them the shop's not buying that category tonight, and you send them on their way. Rule 7. Never leave a layaway item in the back room overnight if the customer who put it on hold has missed 3 payments in a row. Move it to the front case before your shift ends, even if it means breaking protocol on storage. 3 missed payments means something different changes about that item, and you don't want it sitting back there when that change happens. Rule 8. Otis paused on this one, the same way the weight of it needed a beat of silence before he could let it out. If you ever see my name come up on an old layaway slip, or hear my name mentioned by a customer who shouldn't know it, you don't bring it up to Glenn. You don't bring it up to whoever replaces you either. You just let it lie. I asked him, same as I'd ask anybody, what exactly that last one was protecting against. He looked at me for a long moment, the tremor in his hands picking up slightly, and said only that some things in this business you don't get explained to you, you just get handed down, the way he was handing them down to me now, and that the explaining tends to happen on its own eventually, whether a man wants it to or not. He left a little after that, didn't offer to shake my hand, just gathered his coat off the hook by the back door and walked out into the parking lot, where an old Lincoln sat waiting under one of the lot's dead security lights. I watched him pull out onto Admiral Boulevard and disappear into traffic, and I stood there in that shop with the notebook in my hands and 8 rules rattling around in my head that made less and less sense the longer I turned them over. Before I go any further, I want to mention something for those of you who've been asking. A lot of you have requested stories outside the strange rules format, so I started a second channel just for that, called Mr. Prussia. Grim Archives. Links in the description if you're interested. Also, drop a location in the comments if there's somewhere specific you'd like a story set, because I read through every single one when I'm deciding what to write next. Now, back to the shop. The first 3 weeks went by easier than I expected, the kind of quiet that made the rules feel like overcaution from an old man set in his ways. Most nights brought in the ordinary churn of a pawn shop, guitars and power tools, and the occasional gold chain from somebody short on rent. Customers running the same tired negotiations, I imagine, play out at every pawn counter in every city in the country. I followed every rule those first weeks with real discipline, closing the gate sharp at 11, counting the drawer silent in my head, watching that blind spot behind the gun case out of the corner of my eye without ever quite admitting to myself why I was watching it at all. There was a wiry older man named Pete Voss, who came in most Thursdays trying to scrape together cash off whatever tools he'd salvaged that week, who'd worked construction around Tulsa for longer than I'd been alive. One night while I counted out his cash, careful and silent the way Otis taught me, Pete mentioned he remembered this shop from back when a different man ran the overnight, somebody before Otis even, though when I asked who, Pete's face went strange and unfocused, like the memory wouldn't quite resolve into a name no matter how hard he reached for it. He said it the way you'd describe a dream that slips through your fingers the longer you try to hold on to it, and I let the subject drop because pressing it seemed to make him genuinely uncomfortable. But 3 weeks of nothing wears a man's discipline down the same way water wears down stone, and I started letting things slip without quite meaning to. I'd glance at the blind spot the second I caught movement instead of finishing the countertask first, telling myself the rule was paranoid superstition from a man who'd clearly spent too many nights alone in an empty shop. Nothing ever came of those early glances, no shape resolving in that dead zone the cameras couldn't reach, just shadow and the dull gleam off gun case glass, which only made the rule feel more foolish every time I broke it without consequence. It was the 11th or 12th night when the first real test came. A man walked in close to midnight carrying something wrapped in an old towel, set it on the counter, and unwrapped a pocket watch that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than a Tulsa pawn shop. Gold case tarnished dark, a face with numerals I didn't recognize from any clock I'd ever seen, more like symbols than digits. Rule 1 said, appraise fast. Don't ask where it came from, get it in the case quick. I ran it through the scanner the way I was supposed to, and the number that came back was higher than anything else in the shop. High enough that I hesitated, high enough that I wanted very badly to ask him where exactly he'd gotten something worth that much money. I didn't ask. I paid him what the scanner said, same as Otis told me to, and got the watch into the display case before the gate came down that night. I should have left it there. Instead, sometime past 1 in the morning, with the shop dead silent and nothing else demanding my attention, I found myself standing in front of that case, studying the watch's strange numerals, turning over in my mind exactly what kind of man walks into a pawn shop at midnight with something that valuable wrapped in a bath towel. I didn't touch it. I didn't open the case. I just looked, longer than I should have, the kind of looking that feels harmless until you remember nobody told you looking was the safe part. The ceiling fan's count went wrong that same night. 4 ticks landing on 3 rotations, same as always. Except this time, a 5th tick joined in around 2 in the morning, arriving with no rotation to explain it at all. Just a single extra click hanging in the air like something testing whether I'd notice. After that first close call, things settled again for almost 2 weeks. Quiet enough that I started believing the watch and the extra tick had been nothing more than nerves catching up to me after a stressful night. Dana and I picked out a crib during that stretch, the first real purchase we'd made for the baby, and for those 2 weeks the shop felt almost ordinary again, just another overnight job paying better than it had any right to. Before I go any further, I want to mention something for those of you who've been asking. A lot of you have requested stories without the strange rules format, so I started a second channel just for that called Mr. Grim Archives, links down in the description if that's more your speed. Also, if there's a particular location you'd like a story set in, drop it in the comments below, because I read through every single one of them when I'm deciding what to write next. Alright, back to the shop. The printer jammed for the first time about a month in, right in the middle of processing a routine loan on a circular saw for a regular customer named Hector, who came in maybe twice a month. The ticket fed through half-printed, paper crumpling at an angle, and when I pulled it free to feed a fresh sheet through, I caught a flash of text on the jammed half that wasn't Hector's name at all. A different name entirely, printed clean in the same font and layout as every other ticket, like the printer had simply decided to process somebody else's transaction in the middle of his. Rule 3 said, void it immediately, don't show the customer, don't read it out loud. I didn't read it out loud. I did read it silently before I crumpled the slip into the trash, and the name has stuck with me since in a way I can't fully explain. 3 syllables that don't belong to anybody I've ever met, printed on a piece of paper that had no business knowing them. I printed Hector a clean ticket after that, and he never noticed anything wrong. Just signed where I told him to sign, and left with his cash, same as any other Thursday. I sat there afterwards staring at the trash can like the crumpled slit might do something if I looked away from it too long, and it was a good 10 minutes before I worked up the nerve to actually take the shop's trash out to the dumpster, faster than I needed to, glancing over my shoulder. The whole walk across that dark parking lot. The wedding ring came in on a Tuesday, close to 11:30, a woman in her 40s who looked like she'd been crying recently, mascara smudged at the corners of her eyes in a way she hadn't quite managed to fix before walking in. She set a gold band on the counter and asked what I could give her for it. Said it used to belong to her husband. Said she needed the money more than she needed the reminder of him sitting in her jewelry box anymore. I reached for the ring on instinct, the way you'd reach for any item somebody set down for appraisal. And the second my fingers touched it, I understood exactly why Rule 6 existed without anybody having to explain it to me. The band was warm, body temperature warm. Warmer than a ring should ever be sitting out in an air-conditioned shop at midnight. Warm in a way that felt less like residual heat and more like something still actively producing it. I told her, the way Otis instructed, that the shop wasn't buying that category tonight, and watched her face cycle through confusion and then something closer to relief, like some part of her had been hoping I'd say no. She left without arguing, ring still in hand, and I spent the rest of that shift with my own hands feeling slightly too warm no matter how many times I ran them under the bathroom faucet in the back. The layaway situation came to a head about 6 weeks in. A man had put a vintage rifle on hold months before I started, paying in small installments according to the file Otis left behind, except his payments had stopped entirely right around the time I took over the shift. I checked the layaway log out of simple diligence one slow night and realized he'd missed 3 payments running, which meant, according to Rule 7, I needed to move that rifle out of the back room and into the front case before my shift ended, regardless of what storage protocol normally required. I almost didn't bother. It was nearly 4 in the morning, I was exhausted, and walking into the back room to dig out a single rifle felt like more trouble than the rule seemed worth. But something about the weight Otis had put behind that rule, the way he'd said, "You don't want it sitting back there when that change happens," stuck with me enough that I dragged myself back there anyway. The rifle's case felt different than I remembered handling it during inventory my first week, not heavier exactly, but denser somehow, like the wood had taken on a kind of weight that had nothing to do with mass. I got it up to the front case with 20 minutes to spare before the gate needed to come down, and the second it was sitting under the front lights instead of back in the dark storage room, that strange density seemed to lift right out of it, leaving behind nothing but an ordinary rifle that hadn't been collected in months. I didn't sleep well after that shift, lying awake turning over what exactly would have happened if I'd left it back there one more night. What kind of change Otis meant when he said something different happens to an unclaimed item after 3 missed payments. About a week later, curiosity got the better of me regarding Rule 8. I asked Glenn directly, on one of the rare afternoons our shifts overlapped for a handoff, how long Otis had actually worked the overnight before me. Glenn's face did something careful at the question, the kind of careful that comes from a man choosing his words rather than not knowing the answer. He said Otis had worked there longer than Glenn himself had owned the place, going back to whoever ran it before him. But when I pushed for an actual number of years, Glenn changed the subject toward inventory counts and didn't circle back to it no matter how I tried to steer the conversation again. I looked Otis up myself one afternoon, found an old listing for a man with that name in an obituary from a Tulsa paper dated almost 4 years back, age and general description close enough to unsettle me. Though the photo was too grainy on the scanned archive to say for certain it was the same face I'd shaken hands with on my first night. I told myself plenty of men share a name and a rough age in a city the size of Tulsa. I told myself that more than once, the way you tell yourself something you don't quite believe but need to function regardless. A few nights after that, I had a second close call. I still haven't fully made sense of. A regular customer, an older woman who pawned the same few pieces of jewelry every couple of months to cover utility bills, mentioned in passing that she'd seen someone matching Otis's description walking along Admiral Boulevard near the shop a few nights back, late, well past when any reasonable person should be out walking that stretch of road. She said he'd been standing near the shop's front window after the gate was down, just looking in, hands at his sides, gone by the time she circled back around the block to get a better look. I told her I hadn't seen anybody, which was true as far as it went, and filed the detail away alongside everything else that had stopped adding up since I started that job. I ran into Pete Voss again a few weeks after the night with the blind spot, in on a Thursday, same as always, trying to pawn a set of socket wrenches he swore he'd only use again once times got better. I asked him, careful not to push too hard given how he'd reacted the last time, whether he remembered anything else about the man who'd run the overnight before Otis, the one whose name had slipped through his memory like water through a screen. He thought about it longer than I expected, scratching at the gray stubble along his jaw, and said the only thing that ever came back to him about that man was a single detail that had stuck despite everything else fading, that he'd always worn the same brown coat no matter the season, summer or winter, hot Tulsa August or freezing February, like the coat wasn't really about staying warm at all. I didn't tell Pete what I'd seen standing in that blind spot. I just thanked him for the wrenches, counted out his cash silent in my head, the way I'd trained myself to do without even thinking about it anymore, and watched him walk back out into the parking lot, wondering how many men exactly had worn that same brown coat behind this counter before it ever reached Otis's shoulders, and how many more might end up wearing it after me. The night everything finally came apart started like any other shift. A handful of customers through the early evening, a slow trickle of pawns and a couple of layaway payments, nothing out of the ordinary. Around 1 in the morning, alone at the front counter counting the drawer, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, right at the edge of the blind spot behind the gun case. Rule 4 said, finish the counter task first, slow and steady, only look once I'd finished. I was 3/4 through counting that drawer, silent in my head the way Rule 2 demanded, and the movement back there kept catching at the edge of my vision, insistent in a way that made finishing the count feel like the hardest thing I'd ever done. I held on. I finished the count, total locked silent in my head the way Otis taught me, wrote the number down without a word leaving my mouth, and only then did I let myself turn fully toward the blind spot. Nothing was there. Just shadow. The dull gleam off the gun case glass, the same nothing that had always been there every other time I'd glanced over too early and found it empty. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, and that's when the phone behind the counter rang, an old landline Glenn kept for the shop's business line, caller ID coming up as a string of the same strange symbols I'd seen on that pocket watch's face weeks earlier, characters that weren't quite numbers and weren't quite letters either. None of Otis's 8 rules said anything about an actual phone, which left me standing there with my hand hovering over the receiver, no instruction to fall back on, nothing telling me whether picking it up broke some unspoken extension of Rule 5 or whether ignoring it was the actual mistake. I let it ring out in the end, 12 rings by my count, 12 more than any normal call would need before somebody gave up. The moment it stopped, every light in the display case nearest the gun case flickered once, hard, and came back steady. And in that half-second of dark I heard, very clearly, the sound of the ceiling fan ticking 5 times instead of 4, against 3 rotations. The extra tick from weeks earlier no longer occasional but constant now, a 5th beat that had apparently decided to stay. I checked the blind spot again, slower this time, and found a shape standing there that hadn't been visible a moment before. Tall, still, facing away from me toward the back room rather than toward the counter. I recognized the coat before I recognized anything else about him. The same coat Otis had worn, the night he trained me, gathered off the same hook by the back door before he walked out to his Lincoln and disappeared into traffic on Admiral Boulevard. He didn't turn around. He didn't say anything. He just stood there in that blind spot the cameras couldn't reach, facing the dark of the back room like he was waiting for something to come out of it, or like he'd been put there specifically to make sure nothing did. I don't remember deciding to speak. The word just left me before I could stop it. His name, Otis, breaking the back half of Rule 8 clean in 2 before I'd even processed what I was doing. The shape didn't react the way a person reacts to hearing their name. It simply stopped being there. Not fading, not stepping backward into deeper shadow, just gone between one blink and the next. The 5th tick stopped after that. The fan went back to its steady 4 against 3 the moment the shape disappeared. Like whatever had been adding that extra beat had only been doing so while it stood there in the blind spot. And once it left, the count corrected itself back to whatever rhythm the shop considered normal. I didn't call Glenn that night. I sat behind the counter until the sun started coming up through the bars on the front window, going over every rule Otis had given me, trying to work out exactly which one I'd broken and what it actually cost me to have broken it. Saying his name out loud wasn't on the list in so many words. Rule 8 only said not to bring his name up to Glenn or to whoever replaced me, but some part of me understood that the spirit of the rule covered more ground than its literal wording, the same way I'd understood breaking Rule 3 in spirit weeks earlier by turning that misprinted name over in my head even though I'd never spoken it aloud. I went back the next shift anyway, because the rent didn't care any more than it had back when I was hunting for work after the transmission shop let me go. And because some stubborn part of me needed to know whether one slip meant the end of something, or just the beginning of a longer reckoning I hadn't fully understood yet. In the weeks since, I've kept the notebook close, reading back through all 8 rules most nights, even though I know them cold by now. The way a man checks a lock he's already certain is fastened just to feel the reassurance of checking it again. I haven't broken silence on Rule 8 since. I haven't said his name out loud, not to Glenn, not to Dana, not even to myself in the quiet of my own head when I catch myself thinking about that coat standing in the blind spot. I write it here only because writing isn't quite the same as speaking, or at least that's what I tell myself. The same fragile logic that's kept me functioning through every other strange thing that's happened in that shop since I took the job. I went looking for that obituary again about 2 weeks after the night with the blind spot, wanting a clearer look at the photograph than the grainy newspaper scan had given me the first time. The library's archive had reorganized its digital records in the meantime, and the listing I'd found before no longer turned up under the same search terms, no matter how many variations of his name and the date I tried. I asked the reference librarian if records ever simply disappeared from their system, and she told me it happened sometimes during database migrations, files corrupting or getting misfiled in ways nobody fully understood, an answer ordinary enough that I might have accepted it from anybody else about any other topic. Glenn never brought up Otis again after that one afternoon I pushed him for details, and I never raised the subject either, both of us settling into an unspoken arrangement where his name simply didn't come up between us anymore. I noticed, though, that Glenn started showing up for the occasional overnight himself every couple of weeks, unannounced, never explaining why, just letting himself in through the back around 2 or 3 in the morning and sitting in his office with the door cracked, like he wanted to be near the shop during those hours without quite wanting to admit what he was checking for. I never asked him directly. Some questions, I've learned, get answered faster by simply waiting them out than by forcing them into the open. The pocket watch sold about a month after I'd taken it in, to a collector who drove up from somewhere near Oklahoma City specifically for it, having seen photos Glenn posted online. I watched that transaction happen with a knot in my stomach I couldn't fully explain, half expecting something to go wrong the moment it left the shop, the gate to jam, the lights to flicker, anything. Nothing happened. The collector paid in full, wrapped it carefully in a cloth he'd brought specifically for that purpose, and drove off without incident, And I've wondered since whether selling it on was exactly the kind of thing Rule 1 was designed to make happen, getting that item out of the shop and into somebody else's hands as quickly and cleanly as possible. Like the rule wasn't really about appraisal speed at all, but about minimizing how long something like that sat under our roof. The woman with the warm wedding ring never came back. Not that I've seen. Though I think about her more often than I'd expect to think about a customer, I turned away exactly once. I wonder sometimes whether she found somewhere else willing to buy it. Whether some other shop without a Rule 6 of its own took it off her hands without asking the kind of questions Otis's notebook had already answered for me before I ever had to ask them myself. I hope, in whatever way a man can hope about a stranger he met once at midnight, that she found a way to let go of it that didn't put her in the path of whatever made that ring run warm in the first place. The man with the layaway rifle came back eventually too, almost 2 months late on his payments by the time he finally walked through the door, full of apologies and an explanation about a family emergency that had kept him from making it in sooner. I handed over the rifle from its spot in the front case without telling him it had spent even a single night sitting in the back room, past the point where Rule 7 said it shouldn't have, without telling him about the strange density I'd felt in its case that night, without telling him anything at all beyond the standard paperwork required to close out a layaway. He thanked me, paid the balance, and left looking relieved in a way that had nothing to do with the rifle itself and everything to do with whatever debt he'd been carrying, that the gun had only been a small piece of. I think about the ceiling fan more than I'd like to admit, listening for that 5th tick on every quiet shift since, the 4 against 3 rhythm that's supposed to be normal, now sounding almost too quiet by comparison, like silence itself has become the thing I'm bracing against rather than noise. Most nights, it stays at 4. Some nights, usually the slowest ones, the ones where the shop feels emptiest even with all its merchandise crowding the walls, I catch myself convinced I hear a 5th beat creeping back in, faint enough that I can never quite confirm it before it's gone again, leaving me standing there straining to hear something I'm not sure I actually want confirmed. Dana noticed the change in me before I ever told her anything specific about the job. Said I'd started sleeping with the bedroom door open at home, something I'd never done before. Said I flinched harder than I used to at sounds that shouldn't have bothered anybody. A dropped pan. A car door closing too loud in the parking lot outside our apartment. I told her the night shift was just wearing on me, which wasn't a lie exactly, just an incomplete version of a truth I still haven't found the right way to hand her without it sounding like the kind of thing that would make her beg me to quit. With the baby coming in a few months now, quitting isn't a conversation I can afford to have yet, not with what this job pays compared to anything else within driving distance that would take me on without experience. I've thought hard, more than once, about whether Otis is actually gone the way that obituary suggested, or whether he's still out there somewhere, caught in some arrangement with that shop that doesn't end just because a man's body stops walking around in the daylight. I think about what it must have been like for him, training me that first night, knowing already what waited for whoever eventually broke the wrong rule at the wrong moment, knowing he couldn't say more than the bare outline of 8 instructions without risking whatever consequence came from explaining too much. I understand now why he didn't meet my eyes for more than a few seconds at a time, why his hands shook the way they did even when he wasn't using them for anything in particular. Some part of him must have already been standing in that blind spot long before I ever saw him there myself. I keep working the shift anyway. Not because I've stopped being afraid of what's back there behind the gun case, not because the 5th tick doesn't still catch in my chest every single time I think I hear it creeping back into the fan's count, but because somebody has to be the one standing behind that counter following the rules exactly as they're written, keeping whatever lives in that blind spot contained to the narrow dead zone the cameras can't reach, instead of letting it wander further into the shop, into the front cases, into the daylight hours when customers who have no idea any of this exists walk through that door expecting nothing stranger than a fair price on whatever they've brought in to sell. I don't know if quitting would end any of it for me personally. I think it would only mean somebody else takes my place behind that counter eventually, some other man my age or younger, broke enough or desperate enough to take a job that pays almost double anywhere else hiring for the same hours, standing in that same spot on his first night, while some version of Otis, maybe Otis himself, maybe whatever Otis has become, recites 8 rules from a notebook gone soft at the edges, and refuses to explain the 8th one beyond saying, "You'll understand eventually, or you won't be here long enough to need to." So I stay. I count the drawer silent every single night. I watch the blind spot only after I've finished whatever task has my hands occupied. I decline every warm ring that crosses my counter no matter what story comes attached to it, and I never, not once since that night, say his name out loud again. Not even when I'm certain I'm alone. Not even when the shop's dead quiet at 4 in the morning and saying it feels like the only thing that might finally break whatever silence has settled over that place since he stopped walking in through the front door himself.